أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. The topic of this lecture today will be exploring the role of the digital Darul Arqam in developing new discourses of Islam in South Africa. I will begin by welcoming you and introducing the lockdown lecture series. Thereafter, we will look at a verse of the Quran that deals specifically with the ideas that I'm hoping to present this evening. Thereafter, we will look at how we define discourse and what is the meaning of this term discourse. We will then be contextualizing the role of the Darul Arqam in relation to the first Sahaba, or the early Sahaba. I would then like for us to reflect a little bit more on the need for healing in our society, as well as some other needs that we could describe or discuss in relation to our communities. One of them being the need for more authentic, holistic forms of engagement with Islam in order to realize meaningful change and empowerment. We will then look at the role of revelation in relation to the Darul Arqam. Before going into describing a vision of the sort of society that we'd like to see for future generations, we will then end off with some concluding thoughts, inshallah. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you and to say that it is my honor and my privilege, and it is a little bit daunting, I must admit, to be starting off the lockdown lecture series. We are certainly living in interesting times, and I'm inclined to wonder as to whether or not we would be having a series like this were it not for the fact that we've been put into lockdown for the next 3 weeks at least. We ask Allah to assist us and to guide us and to accept our intention for the space to be one in which we can share ideas, stimulate new ways of thinking, and to prompt, as my brother Anwar Jetim put it, thought and internal reflection that is needed within our communities. It is encouraging to see that both students, current students, and alumni are taking on the responsibility of reflecting critically on the conditions in which we find ourselves, in the hope that such reflections may prompt critical action and transformative action. We thank Allah for blessing us with the opportunity to engage in this process of seeking and sharing knowledge. We ask Allah to safeguard us from saying or doing anything that is displeasing to Him. And we ask Allah to accept these efforts from us so that they may be a means of our earning His pleasure and forgiveness on the Day of Judgment, inshallah. I'd like to begin by reciting a verse of the Quran that is going to link quite nicely to the theme of our discussion this evening. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. لقد كان لكم في رسول الله أسوة حسنة لمن كان يرجو الله واليوم الآخر وذكر الله كثيرا. صدق الله العظيم. Indeed, in the Messenger of Allah, you have an excellent example for whoever has hope in Allah and the last day and remembers Allah often. I'd like for us to expand a little bit more on the notion of the Prophet ﷺ being an excellent example or an excellent model. I'm going to be arguing that if the Prophet ﷺ is described as an excellent example, we may be able to extrapolate and to develop a model of discourse development inspired by the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. I'm going to be expanding on this idea a little bit more deeply, inshallah. The seerah is something that resonates with me on a deep level. Because in my view, I believe that it signifies what it meant for Islam to be lived as a lived reality, as a lived experience. We find in the seerah or the life of the Prophet ﷺ, so many examples and stories of people whose hearts and minds were transformed in very drastic ways by the unifying belief in the oneness of Allah and the prophethood of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as expressed through the influence of the Quran, the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the experiences through which their understanding of Islam was developed. Drawing on the seerah with the intention of trying to understand what it means to live Islam in a meaningful way, in a way that is transformative, in a way that is impactful, and impactful not just for the individual but for the society as a whole, is sort of along the lines of what I'm going to be trying to do this evening, inshallah. I'd like to give a little bit of background to this digital Darul Arqam idea. It was an idea that in many ways was born out of a recognition of the fact that there is a need for new ways of thinking around what it means to be Muslim in a post-apartheid context like South Africa. Let's contextualize the conversation. I think it would be fair to describe the various Muslim communities that exist in the Southern African context as a community that is grappling with contradictions. There are contradictions between what we profess and how we act. What may be said and spoken about on the minbar, at the Jummah khutbahs, and the realities that people may be going through on the ground. And I would argue that many of these contradictions may be at the root of some of the frustration, conflict, confusion that might exist and within our communities. Now, that's not to say that conflict is inherently bad. I think in many ways it just depends on how conflict is managed and how conflict is channeled. But it does pose the question of the extent to which we can build as a community and draw closer to Allah collectively if we are still dealing with a lot of these internal battles. And it is on this basis that I would argue that there is a need, a very urgent need, for us to revisit the foundations of our thinking. I'd like to now move on to trying to define what we mean by discourse when we talk about developing new discourses of Islam in Southern Africa. But before I go into that, I wanted to share a story with you of an experience that I had a few years ago. I was driving with my family to Durban, and we stopped to read Jum'ah at a mosque in Pietermaritzburg, I think. As we were leaving the mosque, there was a woman who was begging with her child. And a man from the masjid comes out and he chastises this woman. He tells her to move away, and in a very harsh kind of approach, right? Like his tone was like quite, there was a lot of animosity and anger in the way that he expressed himself. I'd like to take that story and I'd like for us to ask ourselves a few questions. What did this person think about the woman who was poor? How did his thinking inform his actions? Why did nobody in the surrounding area intervene when they saw what this man was doing? What was the masjid doing to support people who were poor and people who were begging in and around the masjid space? And what does this reveal about general attitudes that people, perhaps within our community, might have towards poverty, and our communal obligations, or our farad kifaya, as our president likes to put it, of seeing to the needs of the poor. This would then bring me to the concept of discourse, when we talk about what is meant by discourse. I like this idea because it is a comprehensive concept that speaks on a very deep level to our ways of thinking, our ways of conceptualizing the world around us, our ways of being, and our ways of understanding both the seen and the unseen. It refers to the system of beliefs and actions and ways of thinking. And basically it's about how we think about and act in relation to Allah, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, towards ourselves, towards one another, towards our histories and the histories that have shaped us, and towards the communities of which we are a part. And I would argue that by thinking critically about the discourses that we've internalized and the prevailing discourses that exist in our communities, by thinking about the ways in which we think about ourselves in relation to Allah, our communities, our context, and then making a concerted effort to change these discourses, we can then change how we act and, inshallah, bring about goodness in our communities. In other words, there's a need for us to look more critically at the prevailing discourses that shape our communities, to historicize them, to politicize them, to contextualize them in relation to the legacies of colonialism and apartheid, and to problematize the role that these discourses have played in perpetuating coloniality and in perpetuating colonial ways of learning, thinking, and being, particularly in terms of how they perpetuate anti-Black racism, sexism, gender-based violence, and any number of other issues. That critique is important, especially if we think about the principle that Allah doesn't change the condition of a people until they change the condition of themselves. Because to be honest, I don't believe that the current trajectory that we are on bodes well in terms of whether or not the current discourses that exist in our communities are going to enable us and empower us to engage more deeply with the change that might be needed. Right? And I'm sad to say it, but if we don't address these problems and challenges now, who's to say what the future of Islam in South Africa will look like in, say, 50 years or 60 years? And it brings us back to another verse, another ayah of the Quran, where Allah says something to the effect of, "O you who believe, if any of you go back on your faith, Allah will soon replace you with people He loves and who love Him. People who are humble towards the believers, hard on the disbelievers, and who strike in Allah's way without fearing anyone's reproach or criticism. Such is Allah's favor. He grants it to whoever He will, and God has endless bounty and knowledge." This ayah is found in Surah Ma'idah. It's ayah 54. As it stands, it might be that many of us, myself included, might take our Islam for granted, especially those of us who may have come from established Muslim communities or having been born into Muslim families, etc. And I would argue that unfortunately, perhaps we have not done enough to change how we engage with those whom we've been taught to regard as others, especially racialized others, gendered others, etc. And in all likelihood, we are likely to see shifts in where and within which communities Islam will reside in the next few decades. So having defined discourse and expanded a little bit more on the topic of discourse, I'd like to now contextualize the role of the Darul Arqam in relation to the first Sahaba. So for those of you who may not be familiar with what the Darul Arqam was, effectively it was, you can think about it like the first madrasa that existed in Makkah. So after revelation had started to come down, the Prophet ﷺ established this, effectively it was like a space that was the house of a Sahabi by the name of Arqam, or Abu Arqam. So the space was created for the early Muslims, for the Sahaba, and I'll be going into that in a little bit more depth. But before we even go into describing what the Darul Arqam was and what roles it fulfilled, let's take a moment to think about the context in which the Darul Arqam was situated. We're talking about pre-Islamic Meccan society, which is often described as having been characterized by the sense of Jahiliyyah. And it was a society that was characterized by a number of social ills, whether we're talking about infanticide and femicide, the burying alive of baby girls, in a very real way, the exploitation of the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized, unethical business practices, a society that didn't just worship the idols of wood and clay, but I would argue the deeper, more insidious idols of power and wealth and the market, the belief in self-sufficiency. And I think this leads us to understand that Jahiliyyah may not be necessarily as neatly defined as we tend to think it is. And I think as we go through the process of expanding on the Darul Arqam, I want us to keep this question in mind. And the question is, how does Islam function to purify our hearts of Jahiliyyah? In fact, I'm going to type it in the chat group here, and I'd like for you to think about it. And having described the kind of context in which the Darul Arqam was established, we can then think about what roles or functions did the Darul Arqam fulfill in relation to this context. What I find incredible is that it wasn't just a learning space or a prayer space, but in some ways it was also a space that was safe. It was a space that allowed this emerging Muslim community to draw together in love for one another, in love for Allah, in love for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to learn from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as they reflected on the condition of their society. In many ways, it was a nurturing space, which allowed for very strong foundations to be laid in the hearts of the early Muslims. So using the Darul Arqam as a model, I think a strong case can be made that we need to be establishing similar spaces in our own communities, institutions that fulfill the real need for safe, nurturing spaces. Now, one would hope that our maktabs and madrasas would fulfill this need, but unfortunately, I think we can agree that this hasn't necessarily been the case. A few months ago, I sent out some questions to find out more about people's experiences of madrasa and the experiences of learning in what was supposed to be an Islamic environment. And unfortunately, I heard far more stories of systemic abuse, violence, the installation of fear, which I don't believe are conducive to the laying of strong foundations or solid foundations. So then it's a question of where can people go, if not to the madrasas? And if masajid remain exclusive, if women, for example, don't have access to the masajid, and if our masajid are removed from the project of community building, then where can people turn? And what kind of spaces exist? It's a question that I think we need to be reflecting on a little bit more deeply. Right? And I think in many ways, to contextualize this need in relation to our current situation is to reflect on the need for healing. So this is going to be the next point that I look at. So the formation of the digital Darul Arqam idea was grounded in a recognition of the fact that there are specific needs that exist within our communities that have arisen because of the socio-historical contexts in which we find ourselves. My understanding of these needs has been informed, and obviously it's not complete, and there's still so much to reflect on. But I base my understanding on the interactions with and observations that I've made of student dynamics at our universities, engagements with community members, sort of conversations that we have with people over time, you know, trying to find out how people are, what is going on in their lives. And I think all of these needs will need to be articulated, expanded upon, and reflected upon more deeply. But a major need, in my view, is the need for healing. Healing can be something that is a little bit hard to define, but I think it depends on the context, right? This concept of healing is coming up a lot in a lot of decolonial thinking. And I think it's something that's worth exploring, particularly within our communities. I would like to frame my understanding of healing by saying that it's something that can be experienced and something that can be manifested on a number of different levels. So whether we're talking about personal, interpersonal, communal, and intergenerational, socioeconomic, as well as global levels of healing. So for example, when we talk about personal healing, that's something that resonates with me, right? Because I'm just like anybody else, you know, trying to work out my stuff, my own insecurities and anxieties, you know, perhaps even self-inflicted trauma that we might experience, deeply rooted subconscious issues, whatever it might be. But at the same time, I recognize that the different levels of privilege that exist in our society may affect how much personal healing is needed. But when we talk about personal healing, there's another element to it that I think is worth exploring more deeply. I think it's about coming to terms with our capacity for both good and evil. The fact that while our fitra may incline towards goodness, we also have the capacity to do things that are displeasing to Allah. And the pain that this conflict might create may warrant the need for healing. When we talk about interpersonal healing, you know, it's about confronting our capacity to cause harm towards others, even if we might try our best to engage with good intentions. You know, in whatever fights that might emerge between people, or disagreements that might exist, and we can say and do things that hurt people. So how do we come to terms with that, and how do we heal those relationships? But then we can talk about communal and intergenerational healing, right? So for example, you know, we can talk about the harm that communities have caused to other communities, especially in racialized gender terms, in the perpetuation of anti-Black racism, sexism, systemic exclusion, etc. But when we talk about intergenerational healing, that can refer to, you know, the pain that our parents or grandparents may have carried with them that got internalized in their cycles of raising their children, and then how our parents may have raised us. You know, I can't recall how many, whether or not the elders in my community or the elders in my family, for example, have been the elders in my family haven't really been that open about forced displacement, right? So being forcibly removed from their neighborhoods, you know, because of, you know, the Group Areas Act, for example. And that pain gets carried, right, and gets held onto. And unless it's worked through in a way that enables growth or that facilitates a new way of thinking, that trauma can be very hard to work out. But then we can talk on more broader levels about socioeconomic and psychological need, the need for socioeconomic and psychological healing, right? So I mean, it's about positioning ourselves as people who are living in a society that still has a lot of unresolved trauma that has been caused by colonialism and apartheid, right? And that healing needs to be taking place in ways that uplift people and change their socioeconomic conditions. And then finally, we can talk about global levels of healing, right? So when we talk about the climate justice struggle, these global systems that perpetuate exploitation, inequality, military occupation, fascism, etc. These are global issues that have an effect on the global human community, right? And so my hope is that by identifying this need, it will give us some sense of direction as to what sort of role and function the Darul Arqam, or this digital Darul Arqam, may fulfill. Another need that I'd like for us to expand on a little bit more is the need for, I would argue, more authentic and holistic forms of engagement with Islam in order to realize meaningful change and empowerment. So part of the process of creating nurturing spaces that are conducive to healing, I would argue, requires a recognition of who we are as human beings. And that means coming to terms with our complexity and our purpose and, the unique characteristics that Allah has blessed each of us with. But there's also, part of this process will also include recognizing the need to be authentic, to be humble, and to be sincere in how we engage with Allah. And I think it's not an easy process, because what it involves is grappling with the complexities of faith and the complexities that come with identifying with a particular faith community and belonging to a faith community. It entails grappling in many ways with perhaps our anxieties, our insecurities, our doubts, whatever questions we might have, in a way that allows us to deal with those questions. And I mean, I suppose the next point that I want to make on this is that I believe that there's a lot of emphasis. We notice that there's a lot of emphasis that is placed on seeking knowledge, right, and developing knowledge. And that shouldn't be discounted. But I would argue that this process of seeking knowledge needs to work hand in hand with the development of safe spaces and nurturing spaces. Because to neglect the fact that we're working with human beings and knowledge seekers are human beings, with all of the complexity that entails, while perhaps placing a lot of emphasis on, say, for example, more traditional forms of knowledge, may result in that process being decontextualized, right? Which can come with its own issues. So again, we're coming back to the point of how do we develop more authentic, sincere, meaningful ways of engaging with Islam and what it means to be Muslim. And I think part of it is to recognize that the establishment of the Darul Arqam wasn't the end goal. It was a necessary step that needed to be taken to establish a space in which strong foundations could be laid. But it wasn't the desired end, right? It was a means to an end. But it was a necessary step, right? Because Allah knows what sort of challenges the Sahaba were facing when they stepped into the space. We're talking about people who may have wanted to be better human beings, to be Muslim, in a society that was not conducive to or supporting of that objective. We're talking about people who were dealing with the risk of being rejected by their family for a deep conviction that they might have had. And it may be hard for some of us, but not so hard for others, to imagine how difficult this must have been for them. But we need to engage with these points. We need to think about the Sahaba in this way, if we aspire to see ourselves in the stories of the Sahaba. We need to recognize that them going through these challenges was a part of their journey towards becoming the exceptional generation that we see them as today. So the next question that I'm going to pose is a question that I would like for us to reflect on a little bit more deeply. The question is, what role do you think the Darul Arqam space played in enabling them to overcome some of these challenges? And building on this idea, the second question that I would like for us to explore is, how do we develop a discourse of Islam in South Africa that isn't just about abstract philosophical ideas or empty ritualistic practices, but is rather about applying these principles, applying the principles of our deen in practical ways that might bring about meaningful personal and social transformation. So again, the question is, how do we develop a discourse of Islam in South Africa that isn't just about abstract philosophical ideas or empty ritualistic practices, but is rather about applying the principles of our deen in practical ways that might bring about personal and social transformation? So an important element of the Darul Arqam's functioning was the centrality of the Quran in shedding new light on the situations in which the Sahaba found themselves. And in many ways, it wasn't just about what was said, but it was also about who was conveying the message. The fact that they were learning the Quran directly from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we might view the early Meccan surahs as having played an important role, and perhaps playing an important role, in establishing the foundations that we're going to be working with. But an important question that we need to then raise is, how do we interpret these surahs, right? And how might these interpretations be contextualized in a meaningful way? And I would argue that one way of doing this might be to read these surahs alongside the challenges that we're dealing with at the moment. So say, for example, there's an ayah in the Quran where Allah asks, where he poses the question of, baby girls, the girls who were buried, being questioned about the crime for which they were buried in a context of gender-based violence. And then reading that in parallel to the context that we might find ourselves in, right? And yeah, I mean, Brother Thimi is there, right? Like to reflect more on the context, right? And I mean, we could go into a number of questions around who gets to interpret the Quran, whose lens are we viewing the Quran through? What would happen if we were to wear different lenses in our readings of the Quran? But I think this is a discussion for another time. But in terms of the Darul Arqam, I would argue that it may be useful for us to engage people with where they are at the moment, and then to go into the process of working with those surahs. So to use the example of the Ta'aleef Collective in the US, their motto is "Come as you are to Islam as it is," and I think that's quite beautiful. I think it's an interesting principle that we can be applying. But sort of as I start to wrap up, I think it's important for us to realize that we're not just doing this for the sake of, establishing an initiative and, exploring an idea that might be interesting or might be cool. What we're doing is we're trying to work towards a vision of the sort of society that we'd like to see for future generations, right? It's something that might give clarity to this project. So again, it's about trying to have, at least to some extent, a consolidated long-term vision towards which we're working. Personally, based on where I am at the moment in my life, my concern is in relation to the Muslim student community. And obviously, I will leave room for this vision to evolve and develop over time. I am of the opinion that by working systematically through this sort of developmental framework, we have the potential to build a critical mass that may be needed within our community of leaders, change makers, people who are grounded in their principles with a strong understanding of who they are. A critical mass of people who may be committed to the long-term project of seeking healing in its many different forms, in a way that will uplift not only the Muslim community, but our society as a whole. What we're trying to do, I hope, and I make dua, is to develop a body of conscientious, critical, reflective, groundbreaking leaders who are well equipped with the tools that they need to be driven by their passions and their interests, to be motivated to build a better world for future generations. We want to be building thought leaders who have the capacity to both reflect and to act on those reflections, to utilize praxis, in the words of Paulo Freire, as a tool for social transformation. And I would argue that all of us, everyone that is listening in on this conversation, everybody that will listen in, have a role to play in realizing this vision. So for us, it might be a question of what is the role of MSA Union, or the current members of the MSA Union committee. What is the role of our MSA alumni who may have gone on into different sectors of our society and are doing meaningful work? But now it's a question of how we channel and create channels for that work, to be working towards a common goal. And what is the role of the broader Muslim student community, right? And I'd like to conclude on these points, right? So I would say that ultimately, we recognize that all change comes from Allah. We may just be the vessels through which Allah is working, but any change that takes place is only by the permission of Allah. We also recognize that this project that we're trying to go through, this process of establishing Darul Arqams in our communities, is a long-term initiative, the fruits of which we may not even taste in our lifetimes, but we hope will be a means of our earning reward and Allah's pleasure on the Day of Judgment. And ultimately, I think the key is to do these things and to engage in this process with the right intentions, to seek Allah's pleasure, to engage with humility, and not trying to dominate, right, in terms of our ideologies or agendas or whatever it might be that we feel most passionate about, in such a way that it detracts from the goal towards which we're working. And it's about being committed to uplifting our communities and being of service to our communities and building institutions, perhaps, that may see to the needs and serve the needs of our communities. Life is short, right? And we just have to do the best that we can, because that's what we'll be held accountable for. I don't think Allah is expecting us to end racism or to end, these oppressive structures. But what I do think we will be held accountable for is whether or not we did everything in our power to try and to do the best that we can. The last point that I will be making is to say is along more of the technical aspect of things. And to be honest, I still need to work on developing the technicalities around how to build a digital Darul Arqam. But digitalization, I found, because the way in which the digital Darul Arqam idea has been developed thus far has been, these weekly thematic videos that have been uploaded onto Instagram and Facebook and social media and whatnot. But it's this idea that digitalization is intended to make this idea more accessible and to have a broader reach. And what I think is quite interesting about this is that it doesn't necessarily have to be centralized per se in any specific location. And what it leaves room for is for us to envision a sort of global digital Darul Arqam, which may sound baffling, but it's not necessarily out of the realm of possibility. It could be that there may be other Muslim communities in different parts of the world who may be people from those different parts of the world who may be watching right now, who may feel inspired to do similar sort of work and to adapt it and to contextualize it in relation to their space. So that is my input thus far. I would love to hear your opinions and your thoughts. But just to conclude my end of things, I ask Allah to purify my intentions. I ask Allah to forgive me for my shortcomings. And I ask that Allah may allow this to be a means by which we may earn His pleasure, seek His forgiveness, and earn a spot in Jannah, inshallah. So yeah, I think I'd be keen to hear your thoughts, hear your questions. Let's engage, and we can take it from there, inshallah. Was my explanation so good that there are no questions? I'm kidding. So maybe I can pose the question to you, and then let's see if we can get any responses in the chat. So, how do you think we can go about building? We're talking about the digital Darul Arqam, but in principle, what we're talking about is to develop holistic, nurturing spaces, right? So, what do you think we can do to build these sorts of spaces in our communities? Jazakumullah khairan ihsan. Ameen, ameen. It's an interesting way to spend my birthday. I think it's nice to be able to engage in this sort of discussion with people. Jazakallah, Maria. Come, guys, I'd like to hear your thoughts. So, what do you think? Let me make it a little bit more specific, right? So, okay, interesting. Let's hear. So, which spaces currently in our communities are conducive or suitable as safe spaces or spaces? It's an interesting question. I mean, for a lot of people, the masjid has fulfilled that role. From what I gather, and again, it depends on where you are, I suppose, and your geographical location, the sort of who is sitting on the boards of our masajid, and again, how representative are those masajid board or are those masjid boards of the communities that may frequent the masjid, right? I think it's an important question to ask because so like masajid, youth clubs, sports clubs. And I think it's important, again, to like just reflect on a nurturing space may look different to different people, right? So I don't want to give off the idea that I have the definitive way of defining what a nurturing space will look like. For some people, like sports is their way of having that safe space and the outlet that they might need. For others, it's in engaging in outreach activities, youth clubs that may be geared towards specific projects and cultural activities, whatever it might be. So I don't want it to seem that there's like one limited understanding of what a nurturing space might look like. But yeah, Brother Rashad, I appreciate that input of it. So like masajid, youth clubs. And this might be an idea, right? Like when you talk about our masajid, it's to go into questioning how we might encourage those who are sitting on the boards of our masajid to take these principles and to take these ideas into consideration, and to think about the sort of programs that might be run in our masajid. How inclusive are the masajid of the different people in our communities? But yeah, thank you for that input in the question. Other than providing knowledge, Arqam is also a place where yeah, brother, Jazakallah. Yeah, that's like a really interesting point, right? So the point was, other than providing knowledge, Arqam was also a place where the new Muslims, who especially were the unknown ones, and mostly the poor and slaves, it gave them a sense of belonging and worth in life. It's like such a beautiful thought, right? And personally, I think it's one of it's a really beautiful aspect of our deen, is the notion that what matters in the eyes of Allah isn't how much money you have or how much status you might have in the eyes of society. but it's in the condition of our hearts and how close our hearts may be in attachment to Allah. And that really does give one a sense of belonging. Is it possible to create our own spaces for these kinds of conversations? These could be WhatsApp groups, for instance, in light of the quarantine. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that might be a route that people can take. I mean, I've never used Google Hangouts as much as I have in the last couple of weeks. So I mean, whether we're talking about WhatsApp groups or Google Hangouts, this is the digital aspect of it, right? And I think what's beautiful about that is it also gives us an opportunity to connect to people who may be quite physically far apart, but at the same time, our hearts are coming together in this particular space. So yeah, definitely. I mean, you take the initiative and run with it is what I say. Really appreciating the feedback and the questions and the comments, and let's keep it going. Still got some minutes and some time. Please feel free to engage with people in the chat as well. I don't want to be the only one that's talking, but as you can imagine, this is kind of like the limitation of this particular format. All right, I think if there aren't any other questions or feedbacks or points that need to be raised, we can conclude. Oops, let me just check this quick. All right, if there aren't any questions or feedback, any other points of feedback, then we can conclude the first of the lockdown lectures. Jazakumullah khairan to everybody for participating and for listening in, and I hope that if there was at least one idea or point that was of benefit to you, then yeah, I'd be keen to I just ask that you make dua for me, and I think the MSA is similar to Arqam because we occupy a space such as the university where students are. Oh, okay, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question to be raised as well, right? Like, what can we do to establish these sort of Darul Arqam spaces at our university? Bearing in mind that it might be that to establish such a space, it might mean to engage in dialogue with students who may not be Muslim, right? And to invite them into the space, to let your character shine, to demonstrate what it means to engage with faith in a meaningful way. So yeah, let's do that. Maybe that's a commitment that each of us can make then, for those of us who are still in the university space, right? I'd like you can think of it as your homework, right? It's the question of what can you do to establish something of a Darul Arqam space at your university that is going to be welcoming of people and that is going to be inviting of people, so that they may be drawn closer towards Islam. They may be taught about who they are in relation to Allah, and that so that we can learn from others as well. Right? A good foundation depends on. Yes, that is a good point. Unfortunately, I'm not well equipped with the tools needed to. So I'm not a muhaddith in the sense of somebody who has studied the science of hadith. But yeah, I mean that input is necessary, right? And I'll leave it there. Jazakumullah khairan, everyone. If there are any other questions or points, please feel free to message me. I am on the different WhatsApp groups. You can find me on Instagram at Son of Songbirds, and on Twitter at Aasif Bulbulia. So yeah, Jazakallah to everyone for joining in on this conversation. And may Allah place barakah in the rest of the lectures that are going to be taking place. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.